I stopped sending money to my in-laws 4 years ago, and for 4 years, they told everyone in Little Rock that I'd disappeared. Not that I'd stopped answering their calls, not that I'd finally said no, disappeared. Like I was a ghost story they told on Sunday dinner. Then my sister showed up at my door in Charlotte, and the first thing she did when she saw my face was go pale and back down the porch steps like she'd seen something dead walk toward her. She didn't say hello. She pulled out her phone, hands shaking, and dialed a number I knew by heart because it used to be saved in my own phone as home. I heard him answer. I heard her say, "You need to see this. It's not what you—" And then she stopped, like she realized I was standing 3 feet away listening to every word. Would you have slammed the door? Would you have needed to hear the rest of that sentence first, even knowing it would hurt worse than not knowing at all? I stood there and let her finish it, because some part of me already understood what "it's not what you think" actually means. It never means what it says. My sister Renee hadn't seen me in 4 years either, but it wasn't shock on her face. It was fear, the kind of fear you have when you're caught somewhere you're not supposed to be. I looked at her phone, still lit up with his name on the screen, my husband's name, and something cold moved through my chest that had nothing to do with the fall wind coming off the porch. Renee lowered the phone slowly. "Melissa," she said, my name sounding strange from her after so long. "This isn't— I can explain." I let her in. Not because I forgave anything yet. I let her in because I needed to hear the explanation with my own ears, in my own kitchen, where I could watch her face the whole time she gave it to me. She sat at my kitchen table, the same one I'd bought secondhand the year I moved to Charlotte alone, and she told me that she and my husband David had been together for almost a year. Not an affair that started after I left, an affair that started while I was still in that house, still sending half my paycheck home every month to keep the lights on for people who apparently told the whole town I'd vanished. I asked her how long her parents had known. She said they didn't know, only that David told them I'd cut them off, stopped calling, disappeared into whatever life I'd built for myself 2 states away. He'd never told them why I really left. "They sent me to find you, because David said he lost your new number. He said he was worried." I almost laughed. David had my number. David had always had my number. He just hadn't used it in 4 years. Not once. Not even the year I sent him money every single month for a marriage he'd apparently already left behind in every way that mattered. I went to the hall closet and pulled out a shoebox I still kept, out of habit more than sentiment. Every card my in-laws had sent over 4 years, thanking me for the money, asking when I'd visit, never once mentioning that David had told them I'd disappeared. I set the box on the table between us. Renee stared at the box for a long time before she looked back up at me. "They don't know any of it," she said quietly. "Not about us, not about the money. He's been telling everyone a different story for years, Melissa. If you found out the story people were telling about you wasn't even close to the truth, would you want to correct it, or would you let them keep believing whatever made them comfortable? Tell me in the comments, and if this story already has you sitting up, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because it's about to get a lot more complicated." I want to back up because you need to understand what those 4 years actually were before you understand what happened next. I left Little Rock at 29, not because I stopped loving my husband, but because I finally did the math on a marriage that had been draining me slower than anyone could see from the outside. David never held a steady job the whole time we were married. I did. I worked as a claims adjuster, then moved into underwriting, and every raise I got seemed to disappear into something. His brother's business idea, his mother's medical bills, a truck he needed for a job that never lasted more than 4 months. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that for 6 years. When I finally left, it wasn't dramatic. I packed 2 suitcases while David was at his brother's, drove to Charlotte because a college friend had a spare room, and started over completely. I kept sending money home for a while, out of guilt, out of habit, out of some leftover loyalty to people who'd been kind to me once. Then, slowly, I stopped. Not out of spite, just because I finally asked myself what I was even paying for. In Charlotte, I got hired at a mid-sized insurance firm downtown, and for the first time in years, my paycheck was entirely mine. I paid off debt David had put in both our names without telling me about half of it. I moved into a real apartment, not a spare room. I started sleeping through the night again. I didn't build an empire, I just built a life that was quiet and honest and entirely my own. And it turned out that was worth more than I'd ever let myself believe. Renee watched me get all this together, still sitting at my table with the shoebox of cards between us. "You built all this alone?" she asked, and there was something in her voice I didn't expect. Not jealousy exactly, but a kind of grief for a version of her own life she hadn't chosen. I told her yes, every bit of it. The promotion 2 years in, the car I paid off outright, the therapy I finally started going to that helped me understand why I'd stayed in a marriage that cost me more than it ever gave back. I told her David hadn't earned a single dollar of any of it, and he'd spent 4 years telling people a story where I was the one who vanished. Renee's phone buzzed again on the table between us. David's name lit up the screen a second time. Neither of us reached for it. He's gonna keep calling. He's probably already driving here. I looked at the clock. Little Rock was almost 6 hours away by car. If he'd left the second she hung up on him, he had time to make it by early morning. I realized, sitting there, that I wasn't afraid of him showing up. I was curious what he'd say when he found out his story had finally caught up with him. Have you ever built a whole new life quietly, only to have your old one come knocking right when you least expected it? Let me know below, and stick with me because David does show up, and it doesn't go the way anyone in the story expects. David arrived at 5:40 the next morning, banging on my door hard enough that my neighbor's porch light flicked on across the street. I opened it in my robe, coffee still in hand, and watched him try to arrange his face into something like concern. 4 years had aged him more than I expected. Or maybe I just stopped being someone who softened the truth about how he looked. "Melissa, thank God," he said, like he'd been the one searching for me all along. "Your parents have been worried sick. We all have." I let that sit in the cold morning air for a second before I answered. "Renee told me everything, David." Then, long silence. His face did something complicated, the same shock, then calculation look I imagine plays across every man's face the moment he realizes the story he's been telling has finally run out of road. "It's not what it looked like," he started, and I actually laughed, short and sharp, because I'd heard almost that exact sentence from Renee on my porch the night before. Apparently, they hadn't even bothered coordinating their excuses. "I know exactly what it looked like," I told him. "A year, David, while I was still living in that house, still sending money home every month so your mother could keep the lights on. And the whole time, you told everyone I disappeared." He tried a different angle, the one I should have expected from a man who'd spent our entire marriage rewriting reality to suit whatever room he was standing in. "You left, Melissa. You stopped calling. What was I supposed to tell people?" "The truth," I said, "that I left because you spent 6 years spending money that wasn't yours and calling it temporary. That would have been a start." He shifted his weight on the porch step, and for a second, I watched him try on 3 or 4 different versions of the next sentence before he settled on one. "It wasn't always temporary," he said. "Some of that money went toward things that mattered. My mom's surgery, the truck so I could actually work." "The truck lasted 4 months, David, and you never once asked me if I could afford to keep sending it. You just assumed I would, because I always had." He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him look past me into the house, like he was searching for some sign that things had gone worse for him without him, something that would let him feel like the 4 years had cost him, too. Instead, he saw a clean kitchen, a coffee maker that wasn't held together with tape, a life that had clearly kept moving without him in it. Renee came out onto the porch behind me at that moment, still in yesterday's clothes, and David's face shifted again, seeing the two of us standing together instead of against each other the way he'd probably counted on. "You told her you lost my number," I said to him, holding up my phone with his contact still saved, unchanged in 4 years. "You've had this whole time, you just never used it because the story worked better without me in it to correct anything." For the first time since I'd known him, David didn't have a comeback ready. He just stood there on my porch steps in the cold, 6 hours from home, caught between two women he'd lied to in completely different ways for the exact same reason. Renee wouldn't look at either of us directly, her arms crossed tight against the morning chill, and I realized she probably hadn't slept much either. "You should go," I told him, quieter now, the anger burning down into something steadier. "But before you do, there's something I want you to do first." I told him I wanted one thing from him before he got back in his car: to call his mother right then, on speaker, and tell her the truth about where I'd been for 4 years. He looked at me like I asked him to do something far harder than it actually was. Maybe for a man who'd spent 4 years rewriting his own history, it was. Would you have made him do that right there on the spot? Or would you have just let him leave and told the truth later on your own terms? I want to hear your take. Like this video if you're invested in Melissa's story, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens on that call. David didn't want to make the call. I watched him look for a way out of it for almost a full minute, glancing at Renee like she might rescue him from this the way she apparently had from everything else the last year. She didn't move. He dialed. His mother picked up on the second ring, already talking before he could get a word in, asking if he'd found me, if I was okay, if I'd finally come to my senses after all this time away. I watched something in David's jaw tighten as he realized exactly how deep this story had been allowed to run. "Mom," he said, "Melissa's fine. She's been fine this whole time. I need to tell you something." The pause on the other end of the line stretched out long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped. I won't pretend the conversation that followed was clean or satisfying in the way you'd want from a story like this. He didn't confess everything perfectly. He stumbled through half-truths even then, softening his own role, blaming timing and stress and a marriage that had already been struggling. But he said enough. Enough that his mother went quiet in a different way, and enough that Renee finally spoke up beside him and told her own part of it too. His mother's voice, when she finally spoke again, was smaller than I remembered it. She asked why nobody had told her. She asked if I'd known the whole time I was still sending money home. I stood close enough to hear it all, and for a moment I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but a strange kind of sympathy for a woman who'd been lied to almost as thoroughly as I had, just in a different direction. I didn't feel triumphant listening to it. I felt something closer to exhaustion. The kind that comes after carrying something heavy for so long you forget what your arms feel like without it. 4 years of being the missing woman in someone else's story, and here I was, on my own porch, finally just being believed. After the call ended, David asked, almost quietly, if there was any chance of starting over. Not with Renee, with me. Like the last 20 minutes hadn't just proven exactly why that would never work. I told him no. Not out of anger anymore. That had mostly burned itself out somewhere between the shoebox of cards and the phone call to his mother. I told him no because I'd spent 4 years building a life that didn't have room in it for someone who needed a crisis to finally tell the truth. He asked if I was sure, like 4 years and one phone call could be undone by asking twice. I was surer of this than I'd been of almost anything in our marriage. Something about saying it out loud, on my own porch, in my own voice, made it feel more real than it had even a minute earlier. I watched his hands shake, just a little, as he tried to find an argument that didn't exist. He looked at me, really looked at me, as if he were seeing the person I had become while he was busy living a lie. For a second, I thought he might actually say sorry, a real one, without a list of excuses attached. But that wasn't David. Instead, he just sighed, a sound that held all the weight of his own failures, and turned toward his car. It was the most honest thing he'd done in years, walking away because he knew there was nothing left to negotiate. Renee stayed behind after David drove off. We sat on my porch steps as the street woke up around us, and she asked if I could ever forgive her. I told her I didn't know yet, that forgiveness wasn't something I could hand over just because the truth had finally come out. It would take time, if it came at all. She looked at the empty street where David's car had been just moments ago, then looked back at me. She started to explain again about how she felt trapped in the middle, but I held up a hand. I didn't want the excuses. I wanted the truth, and for the first time in forever, I had enough of it to be full. She seemed to realize then that the dynamic had shifted completely. I was no longer the person who needed her validation, and she was no longer the person who held the keys to my peace of mind. She nodded like she expected that answer, and we sat there a while longer without saying much else. It wasn't a warm silence. It wasn't cold either. It was just two people who used to know each other completely, trying to figure out what, if anything, was left to rebuild. Looking at those empty mugs, I realized I had spent years waiting for someone else to pour me a drink, to tell me I was enough, or to validate the life I was building. But sitting there, with the morning air turning from crisp to warm, I understood that I had already been doing the work. The only thing missing was the permission I'd been withholding from myself. I thought about the 4 years I'd spent trying to balance the ledger, as if enough money could eventually buy back my dignity or make David see me as an equal partner. It hadn't. It just kept the cycle spinning. Letting that go didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a weight dropping off my shoulders, leaving me lighter than I had been in a decade. I finally realized that my silence had been the foundation of his lie. By deciding to stop being quiet, I wasn't just ending a marriage, I was reclaiming the narrative of my own life. I didn't get a dramatic ending where everyone learns their lesson and the family heals in one clean afternoon. My in-laws called a few days later, awkward and unsure how to talk to me after 4 years of believing a story that wasn't true. Some of them apologized. Some of them still haven't. David moved out of state a few months after that morning on my porch, and I heard through people I still barely talk to that things didn't work out with Renee either. Not that it was ever really about her to begin with. What I got wasn't revenge in the way people expect. I didn't ruin him. I didn't need to. I just stopped letting his version of events be the only one anyone ever heard. That turned out to be enough to unravel everything he'd built out of half-truths without me lifting a finger beyond one honest phone call I made him place himself. Some nights, I still think about those 4 years of shoebox cards, all that gratitude sent to the wrong version of the story. I don't regret sending the money while I was still in that marriage. I regret how long it took me to understand that being generous and being respected were never the same thing, and that I could stop giving one without losing the other. I still don't know exactly where things stand with my sister, and I'm not going to pretend that's tied up neatly either. Some things take longer than a single conversation to repair, if they repair at all. If you've ever had to correct a story someone else told about your life, I want to hear it. Like this video, subscribe for more, and tell me below, would you have forgiven Renee, or is some betrayal too close to home to come back from? I'll see you in the next story.